The Andromeda Galaxy aliens are a group I've talked about a number of times on this channel, some more than the others. I previously covered their featured arc in a video I did on Aggregor's quest, where I talked about all the goings-on of that arc and everything that happened with each of them individually. But in today's video, I want to go on about answering the question, what happened to the Andromeda Galaxy aliens? Both the DNA samples themselves, but more than that, what became of those alien transformations over time after their initial debut on Alternate Alien? Just to be as brief as possible for anyone who isn't familiar with them, the Andromeda Galaxy aliens, or the Andromeda 5, are a collection of aliens who were kidnapped by an Osmosian villain Aggregor, who used them to telecreate an amalgam form that would be powerful enough and versatile enough to reach the map of infinity. The crux of this video really hinges on what these aliens represented at the time and what they've gone on to be in later appearances. These 5 at the time really felt like a step up in the general power hierarchy of Omnitrix transformations. At a time in the series when most every alien felt redundant unless they had an alternate form, these 5 entered the series being staples of the Omnitrix, oftentimes being more versatile than the pre-existing aliens Ben had access to. Just as a quick aside, if you're enjoying what I do here and this type of content, I'd really appreciate if you're subscribed. Otherwise, if you want to go beyond that, sharing it around would be really appreciated, but back into it. Each of their DNA sources had such a weight to them, in some cases quite literally like with the DNA sources for NRG and Armodrillo with Pandor and Andreas, both being these walking tanks with wildly destructive powers and abilities. One of them was functionally a walking nuclear reactor with near impenetrable armor, while the other was able to create these enormous earthquakes in the vein of Whitebeard from One Piece. Then you've got the less physically imposing characters with the DNA sources for Amphibian, Waterhazard, and Terraspin, coming from Rad, Bivalvan, and Galapagus respectively. And while these 3 aren't necessarily big units, they each had a wild set of powers. Amphibian species nearly has too many powers to name, but just to strip it back and put it simply, they can control electricity, have intangibility, flight, and a form of mind reading, and that's just to get started. Then you've got Galapagus, who on top of controlling wind, having flight, and all the subsequent abilities that come along with that, also has an immunity to mana, which gives him an unbelievable advantage against any magic characters like Gwen, Charmcaster, Hex, or possibly even Bazel. Not to mention Anidites as a species generally, though I'm sure there'd be some workaround to this. And then finally the one I hadn't really considered all that powerful, Bivalvan, who I thought was really limited to functionally being a waterbender, but has such a powerful exoskeleton that he's nearly invulnerable to any physical attack. I'd always thought it was a mistake on the showrunner's part when Aggregor says he's as invincible as Bivalvan's armor, but turns out Bivalvan is just as much of a physical monster as the earlier 2 on this list, if not more so in some capacity. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, a brief aside and the answer to half the question I posed at the start of this video. As far as their physical whereabouts and the goings-on of the 5 DNA samples we've discussed, they're presumably back on their homeworlds, returning to their old lives, having to live on after everything that happened to them, being kidnapped twice, everything they went through on Earth, being mind-controlled and then absorbed by a villain who is more than willing to sacrifice them as a means to an end. I guess that's really it, they just have to keep going. You'd hope they were given some sort of aid from the plumbers, but that's never really touched on. I'd like to hope Pandor at some stage atoned for his behaviour on Earth, with the whole being happy to radio everyone in the area if it meant he could feed off of a nuclear power station. And to get into the second part of this video and what I'm really answering, what happened to these alien transformations? To put it simply, they lost the weight they were given in Alternate Alien, for me at least. Seeing them so heavily featured at the beginning of Omniverse was such a treat, especially my first watch through of the series. Having these transformations that were each individually gotten through the DNA acquisition feature really made them feel earned to me, and Ben using them really tied Omniverse into the previous series. Not to mention, I think all their designs really translate quite well to the Omniverse art style. NRG was probably my favourite in terms of visual changes. I wasn't quite as fond of the tweaks they made to Armodrillo, but that's a pretty minor critique. That, and I really loved what they did with Waterhazard becoming more crab-like with those barnacles and more crustacean features. As far as that weight I mentioned they all shared in Alternate Alien, I feel like that really disappeared come Omniverse, and thinking about that, it's really a positive thing. As great as they all were and continue to be, having them play too prominent a role or having them outshine other aliens just for the sake of it would just tarnish other transformations. Instead, they moved into a supporting role rather than being headline aliens. I don't know if headliner aliens is a term the community uses, but if not, I'd like to coin that. Now they're more of their own sort of sub-playlist within the Ultimatrix roster, just like your legacy aliens of Classic or Alien Force. They're no less than they were, they're just more so part of a collective and have their own little grouping in a similar way to the North System aliens. Come to think of it, I'd really like to see more aliens grouped by what galaxy they come from. Before we move on, I cannot stress enough how much I enjoyed the transformation sequences in Omniverse. While varied, they were always so much fun. And there's something so dynamic about the Omniverse transformations, you never know exactly what you're going to get. Though I should say, I do really like the look and feel of the Alien Force transformation sequences. And that's another thing about Omniverse's take on these aliens. Like with most things in Omniverse, they're more exaggerated and cartoony. though this applies largely outside of the Andromeda 5. The new voice for NRG really felt like added more to the character than the original did. The change in speech pattern really creates this feeling that the transformation affects Ben's personality more than a simple voice change, without having to do any more than just that. While Armodrillo now feels more clumsy and bulky, and the way Ben moves around as this transformation reflects that more in Omniverse, rather than the more serious and slightly restrictive movements present in Alternate Alien. A few more tidbits and loose ends before we wrap things up. I wouldn't feel right covering these aliens without making note of other examples of their species, like with Terraspin's villain counterpart in Addwaitya. And like I said, a fellow member of his species who also happens to be one of the most powerful sorcerers in the universe. Though I think it should be noted that he seems visually quite different from other members of his species. Floating magical skull aside, I presume that's an effect of being an evil sorcerer of some sort. Beyond that, he appears noticeably larger than Ben's transformation, and on top of that, he's generally built a bit differently. He doesn't have the usual flippers other members of that species do, nor does he have the air vents on the front of his torso. Seeing as he's thousands of years old, I like to think this is how the species used to look for the most part, and the other members we see like Galapagus are just the modern evolution and interpretation the species has evolved to. While working this, I did come across Addwaitya's normal form design. The flaming skull is absolutely a result of his magic. Not that I had any doubt about that, it's just that I'd forgotten this design pops up in the series. There's also Ben 23's version of Armodrillo with Toolboxx. I'm not a huge fan of the blue in this design, but the gold highlights really work for me. And last, and possibly least, I'm not sure, I haven't made my mind up on this transformation yet. You've got Overflow from the Reboot, who I'm not remotely familiar with. I'm still in disbelief this isn't just Waterhazard. Now that I've covered all the Andromeda System aliens, just as a fun little exercise, I wanted to go over all the powers Aggregor actually got from absorbing all of these species. I just think it's a bit of fun how absurd this list of abilities is when all paired together. We've got energy absorption, water blast, bioelectrokinesis, force field generation, piston holocrons, I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, aerokinetic blasts, radioactive energy beams, radioactive optic lasers, flight, levitation, strength, durability, jumping, speed via flight, reflexes, space survivability, underwater survivability, speed swimming, mana resistance, cold resistance, heat resistance, prehensile elastic tendrils, and finger retraction. And that's just what's listed on his official abilities. This isn't taking into consideration all the abilities each of these species has individually that he should have had access to. After all is said and done, I really love these 5 aliens. It is such a shame we never got to see their lives beyond the events of Ultimate Alien. It would have been such a treat to explore what they'd been through and who they'd become after such extreme circumstances. But overall, as much as I love these aliens and the weight they had in their debut appearances, I love what they became and where they ended up. Thanks for watching.